Story time with Mr. Julio. Today, Mr. Noisy, the number 16 from Mr. Man Collection by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room, but shoes! When Mr. Nosy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Nosy was asleep in bed in his bedroom in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. As you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who live in Wobble town, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled, Wobble town wobbled, even a bird flying high above wobbled. Then Mr. Nosy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash! Went the door as he opened. Bang! Went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread! Boomed Mr. Nosy to Mrs. Crump, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crump trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Nosy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash! Went the door as he opened it. Bang! Went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat! Boomed Mr. Nosy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mr. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Nosy being so nosy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mr. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled, and a small smile which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Nosy went shopping again. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crump's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, she boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crump, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Nosy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crump. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crump. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Nosey shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Nosey. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Nosey gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. The day after, Mr. Nosey tried again. He went into Mrs. Crump's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mr. Crump. Mr. Nosey started something at the very top of his voice. A loaf of, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crump. Mrs. Crump smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Nosey went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Nosey at the very, very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Nosey set off home up the hill. Clump, 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 clump. Then he stopped, then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Nosey had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Nosey arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped it, and then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Nosey had never tried before either. That was fun too. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Nosey is not anything like as nosy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobble Town are delighted, especially Mrs. Crump and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Nosey has learned how to whisper. Bye bye.